back and just like looking at it like with fresh eyes. So we kind of finished with a block in, and if you remember last time, it was my camera kept going out and I had to like turn my camera. It was kind of funky. So I think I've got things updated and fixed now. I'm gonna knock on this wood, but we we should be good to go.
Woohoo.
Um, so really, once you get a general block in finished, meaning you've got, kind of areas of paint covering at least everything in one layer, you're ready to kind of start thinking about how do you want to blend or add texture, or what do you want to do to bring kind of these finishing touches, together. And so I think about a couple things, and we've talked about, how there's this house back there, and of course my printout, it's tricky to see versus on the screen, but there is a building here, there's these docks here, looks like, either rocks or maybe buoys even in the water perhaps. So, some of those little details, you could choose to not include them, or you can choose to include them. That's really up to you. But things I like to think about, okay, so take this tree, for example. Let me try to zoom in a little too. So obviously, when you look at my tree compared to this tree, okay, I've got the general idea of the tree. It's not exact, it's not, a photo replica, but that's not what I was going for. But you can tell that this is this tree. So looking at my block-in, it's pretty flat. There's, maybe a couple greens here, but it's all relatively darkish. But if you look at this tree here, we have all these little highlights that we're seeing kind of on the tips of these little branches, right? And this, evergreen style tree. So of course, I'm not going to paint every individual little needle. That'd be crazy, right? And I don't see every individual needle either. So I think to myself, this is kind of how my brain works, is how might I interpret that? Like what might look cool or interesting? Maybe that's me looking at a variety of paintbrushes and saying, ooh, maybe this kind of angled one, I could kind of come in and gently sort of tap some little brush, kind of tap my brush, not even make strokes, but just sort of tap it, with just a little bit of paint to create sort of this. And maybe I'm layering some lights and some darks and kind of building that up. Because remember, we need a couple things to consider here. We need values to show contrast that's going to help create depth. So we need lights, we need mediums, we need darks. But then also, we talked about how like the warm tones tend to come forward and the darker kind of cool tones push backward, and especially in this specific landscape here with these mountains being dark in the back. But these kind of lights through here kind of help push forward. We've got a mix here, and then this is really light. And then of course, looking at the texture of the water and looking at my water, of course, mine is very blue compared to this. So perhaps maybe I want to lower the intensity. I could add some orange into my blue paint that will lower the intensity down, and I could bring some washes, or I could glaze some of the other blue on top of this. And if you look really closely, this water's relatively smooth. But really, I'm seeing kind of little horizontal lights and dark areas kind of in between these little sections of the light to the dark. So hopefully I didn't lose you guys while I was talking, but those are just some things I like start to think about, like as I'm going around and kind of picking areas that I want to work on. I think, how might I interpret the texture I see here to put here? And I talked about how block-ins, I usually don't worry about my color and making it so specific. In fact, sometimes I like to bump it up or make it brighter than it actually is, or slightly different, and then bring the more realistic color on top, because again, that provides depth. And I think it's playing around with your different paint brushes. Maybe you have a fan brush. Fan brushes can be kind of fun for kind of tapping in texture on trees. You can even kind of fan it out in both directions. So yeah, just play around with some different brushes and we'll kind of get started here, and we'll start kind of adding some texture and doing a little kind of problem solving with some of these different areas. And, you know, of course, you don't have to use the exact same colors I'm using. And, you know, as I looked at yours last time, I know you all have kind of a different style going on, which is super fun. So, you know, don't feel like it needs to look exactly like mine. Feel like you can experiment and try things. Acrylic paint is very layerable. And Lee, I think if I remember correctly, you're using gouache. Yes.
Yeah.
And so in gouache too, like you have the ability to bring layers on top. It's just, remember, a little less white with each, or sorry, I'm using white paint, so I said white. A little less water with each layer in that gouache. I know you're becoming a gouache pro now. I don't even need to tell you, you know. I love it.
I don't know about that.
So what I'm doing now is just laying some colors down on my palette here. I'll just kind of put that here and show you. So I'm just using a palette paper today, disposable palette paper. I like those for my lazy days. But I've got some white. I've got a little bit of a primary blue. This is like a red violet color. A little magenta down. So I just kind of get some colors ready that I might sort of hop around to. And again, you know, we didn't talk about any specific colors that you needed or had to have or anything like that. So I say just kind of use the color you have that's closest. And just remember kind of different ways to lighten and to darken. For example, mixing with black or mixing with a complement. You could certainly too, sometimes when I'm mixing colors and I'm looking for a specific color, I'll even do little color swatches on separate paper before I put it on this sometimes, you know. But again, the acrylic paint, you can layer it, you can blend it, you can do all sorts of things. So let's see, I'm trying to decide where I want to work. I might, just so this starts to dry a little bit, I'm actually going to bring just a little bit more of the texture into this foreground that I'm seeing right here. This is pretty green. I want to bring out some of these yellows that I'm seeing here. So I've got some yellow ochre, but if you didn't have yellow ochre, you could use a yellow and put like a touch of red or a touch of brown into it. And then let's see. Just kind of have all these colors ready to go so I can hop around. And I've got this other, it's called yellow, Naples Yellow Deep, which is just kind of this light yellow. You could also mix yellow with white together to create something like that. So I'm just gonna kind of use these, the greens, this yellow ochre, and this lighter yellow for kind of some of this area here. And you know, when I'm looking at all these little leaves, again, if I was wanting to paint this hyper realistic, I would count all these little leaves and paint exactly what I see. But since I'm not doing that, I'm just trying to kind of interpret it in my own way. You know, I might try kind of tapping my brush and just kind of understanding that I'm not going to do everything in one pass, in one layer. It's going to take building up. And that's especially true of texture. You know, we've got this nice block-in layer, so we've got this base layer now. So it makes the blending a lot easier. But we still have more layering to do for sure. Actually gonna bring a little brighter, little lemon yellow into this. I still want it to be a little bit more yellowy than I'm seeing here. And again, different brushes will create different kind of taps. So sometimes I don't stick with the same brush the whole time because, I mean, think of leaves. They're not all exactly the same. Even though they have a similar shape, there's all those like slight variations. So sometimes using different brushes will kind of help you capture that. And usually detailing and little, it's like little bits of paint, little changes, little things. You don't necessarily, have to fill in large areas because we've already done that with that block in. And, I think too, like things with details or layering, sometimes I start with some bigger layers and then I work to smaller layers on top of those bigger layers with maybe a slight variation in color. Or, look at the lights and the darks that you kind of see here too. And you can use the paint to kind of put in those light areas and those dark areas. And I will, just in the background while we're painting, turn on a little background music here. And to get some of the darker tones here, I'm actually going to mix a little purple with my yellow because purple and yellow are complementary. That's going to help me get some of those darker tones while kind of having it, go along with what's already here. So even sometimes my shadows, I will layer those. I don't always make them as dark as I see them right away. Especially when, we're working with something with nature, a landscape. There's so many textures, so many colors. So sometimes, when I'm mixing too, I'll just kind of take from all these colors and just sort of mix little subtle variations of similar colors and use that as I'm painting one area. That way it gives me, kind of this nice subtle variety, but keeping things sort of unified with the colors being similar. I'll work on putting together actually like a limited color palette painting or project or something too, because sometimes tons and tons of colors can feel overwhelming. So that's again why I like to sort of mix all these little variations from a few similar colors. Just, start to build those layers, build that texture. And think too, foreground, what we see up front is generally more crisp and in focus than what we see, in the distance too. And if you're painting with acrylic, remember you can do a technique called glazing, which is where you can water down your paint and apply it over top of already dried paint so it kind of pops through. You can do that technique in watercolor as well, but just not gouache. You'll lift it back up. So I know I hop around a lot when I'm painting, but sometimes if I'm kind of doing something like this where I'm just kind of using all these similar colors to mix variations, I'll stay in a spot for a while just because that acrylic paint does dry so fast. And you know, it's okay to stop on an area too, work somewhere else and come back to it. Sometimes you need a little break on an area, or you might need something to dry. Remember, kind of squinting at your image can help you see some of those lights and darks and the contrast, because I know sometimes it gets a little tricky. And just remember too, like with, as far as paint goes, with your blending, wet on wet is going to blend together and create like a smooth blend, whereas the wet on dry is going to create that crisp edge. I know for some of you that's a review thing, but just a reminder. Some of these mid-tones on here, and then I'm going to come kind of actually pop back in some of these highlights. So, I mean, this is very, very dense. There's lots of little leaves there. To build up all those layers. If you need to darken your green a little bit too, or lower the saturation, you can always try just a little bit of red. Remember, we sort of lose saturation as we go back. I'm still kind of working with some greens and just these kind of yellow greens, and just kind of popping in some of these little highlights where I see them. And just remember, if you can't differentiate something, don't let your mind trick you. Just try to paint what you see. There'll be times when that happens where you're not exactly sure, well, what's happening, because lots of things overlap, or you can't quite see it as well as you think you maybe can. So that's where those observation skills come into handy. Just sort of squint your eyes and start to try to paint the different tones that you see. Kind of darken with a little bit of black here. Sometimes I like to mix color with the black too, so it's not so solid. Straight black paint tends to flatten things big time. So I like to mix a little color into that black. Darks help us push things back, and those lights help things come forward. Again, I think about, what type of texture, or how could I move my brush in a way that would enhance the texture that I'm seeing here, or, you know, possibly recreate something else that I want the viewer to see if I want to change something or interpret it in my own way. And that's what painting can be. I mean, you can be very precise if you want, but you can also be expressive. If you get too many branches, you can always bring some blue back in and kind of paint it in between some of the branches to kind of reveal the sky back in those negative spaces if you need to. I just kind of pop in some of these darks, and then I'll come back in and pop in some of those lights. And start to see that contrast. I think one of the best things you can do in your art is push those values, push that contrast, push those tones. So you're seeing that range of light and dark. It can be sort of intimidating sometimes using the dark paint and painting dark, but trust me, when you have the combination, it's going to look really, really awesome. So I have my dark paint and just kind of looking at these trees, this tree line, and I am mixing some green with this black, so it's not solid black here. But I'm just gonna kind of where I see some of these darker values, start kind of popping those in. Kind of pay attention to where the light's hitting versus, you know, kind of where the shadows are. This is sometimes where you get like implied lines too, where tones and colors tend to blend, even though there would be an edge there. Just sort of kind of imagine it might be there. I just kind of stacking and layering these different tones of green. I can create this, you know, illusion of these kind of dense trees all packed in together. I still haven't put in all the highlights that I'm going to yet. I'm still kind of playing with those darks. Your highlights, you know, maybe like some yellow, some white, some of that yellow ochre, and then a bit of green. You know, all your lights don't have to be identical either. You can have a couple different ones. This can be kind of fun. I think, you know, how might I sort of tap in those highlights and sometimes I'll put some paint on with one brush and then I'll take a second brush, and this is called dry brushing. You just sort of take that and tap the paint you applied with it to soften it, make it not so bold or sort of blend it in. That's something you can do with gouache too. again, sometimes I like to play up the color and make it not as realistic. The idea is still the same, to have these kind of light areas and dark areas together. And again, I just think, how could I move my brush, in a way that would be helpful for what I'm trying to paint here. Sometimes you want to put a second layer on or overlap just ever so slightly. But see, some of the other color underneath. If you feel like your yellow's too bright, you can always put a smidge of purple in there. Tone it down a little bit. Again, this to me is the really fun part of painting. I mean, I love the whole process, but I love that end piece where everything's blocked in and sort of laid out, and you're kind of getting to put all these little finishing touches in, like to show what it's gonna look like at the end. And I just love the process of watching that all come together. That's neat. Also can be frustrating sometimes if it's not going exactly how we have planned, but that's when we get to learn to maybe the whole happy accident thing, or trial and error, which again is all part of how we learn how to paint. Over to these bushes a little bit and just kind of building up some of that a little bit too. Highlight over here too. You can always water that down slightly too, just to lower the impact of it. It's not so bold. You can also add a little bit of white too to increase the opacity of any yellows. If you're noticing that it's a little transparent and you don't want it to be. Sort of, there's some sort of maybe rocks or something back there, and not exactly, but just kind of tapping in a little bit of paint to just sort of fill that in, because I don't think I'm going to be putting the dachshund in mine. If you feel like you want to, or you already have, that's awesome. Oops, just dropped my paintbrush. That was close. Only got on the tape though. just remember, like I'm a little broken record here, but what paint wasn't meant to be painted in one layer. So I just encourage you to, if you feel like you're judging yourself and deciding, do you like what you've painted so far or not, just remember you're not done yet. We even have another week too, where we can finalize even more if you feel like you need to. I'm taking just a little dry brush, softening that application of paint. Like I said, even the highlights can have a couple different colors or have some lights and darks. You can go back and forth a little bit if you need to. I'm gonna think about a little bit of the white on the mountains, just a little bit here. The snow, I should say. Again, I'm not worrying about being exact. That's exactly what I see, but you might make it similar. Think about how moving my paintbrush I could achieve what I'm seeing here. The other thing too, don't forget to take a little step back every so often if you haven't done that. Just because when we're painting, we're so very up close to it, kind of hovered over it typically. So sometimes we need to step back and see it from a different perspective to decide how we feel about it. I can bring some more white into my clouds for some of these kind of highlights in the clouds that I don't really have. Kind of punch those up a little bit. And I could take a dry brush if I wanted to and just kind of blend that out or soften those little edges. Sometimes, like you can see in my hand here, I'll paint like this where I'm holding two brushes and I'll paint, my kind of wet paint on, and then I'll use the second brush to do all the blending. Then I'll just dab it off on paper towel and I can keep blending with it. So that's something you could do. But as always, you know, find kind of your own rhythm too. Maybe glazing in just a little bit of kind of pink into the sky. Just meaning I'm taking some watered down pink. Just kind of working that into the clouds a little bit. Glazing is a great way to like subtly add some shading. Just kind of zoom in a little bit too. Just kind of take my brush and lightly kind of tap the edges, dry my brush off, come back in. And I can just sort of, you know, create some different little manipulations within the clouds. And now I think, because I've touched on kind of a little bit of everything except for the water. So I'm going to spend a little time on the water because then I know next time I can wrap things up. Just going to move my palette over a little bit, get myself some blue here. A little bit of this kind of orange, just so I can lower the intensity just a hair. Need a touch of ultramarine. So got some primary with some ultramarine and just like a touch of this light orange color. And as I'm thinking about the water, just kind of as I go over top of my initial block in, I think, where is it light, where is it dark? Water it down just a touch so I can see some of what I've painted underneath. Just some kind of horizontal strokes overlapping. But because my paint, you know, my brush is a little watery, it kind of just blends that. I'll bring some white in there. If you're trying to blend two different colors together in between where they meet up, you can use a dry paintbrush to work relatively quickly. I kind of let that dry, but I can bring some of the dark and you can sort of work those colors into each other. I mean, seeing some of the horizontal lines is kind of nice too. Like I said, it goes along with the idea of painting this water. Dry my paintbrush off a little bit. Maybe use a couple different paintbrushes so I get different types of lines. It's kind of an extra bright spot, kind of in the back right too. Maybe I put a little bit of that in. And sometimes kind of going back and forth between your colors a little bit and just letting them overlap a little will help you create that kind of water effect too. Again, your water doesn't need to look exactly like what you see on here. I definitely have maybe more lines or kind of slightly different lines, but you know, I can kind of tap my brush here and soften some of those while that's still wet, or if you don't like an area, you can certainly go over it. And then you've got kind of this, you know, some of the rocks or a really dark area kind of next to the tree a little bit. Again, I just kind of look at the loose shape I'm seeing. See, how might I recreate that? These edges. You know, I might take a little bit of this color I've got in the water and kind of bring a little bit up into the mountains too. Just kind of glazing that in. It's a little watered down. Again, that underneath color showing through. But this kind of helps me create some unity. And even a little bit, you know, into the background with the sky here, I could bring a little bit of that darkness, glazing, again, watered down color. Some of the dark into the clouds. Again, just kind of looking up over here and just darkening that. Just again, a wash, or not, sorry, glazing with a wash. Kind of tint and tone things this way. I feel like I'm in a pretty decent staffing place, and we've got a little bit of time left, so I'm gonna get situated here so I can, check in with everyone and see how you did and see where you feel you're at, and keep in mind that it's like